I didn't hear the applause, so I got kind of sad. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dami Akinmeji. We're really excited to have you all here. So I lead our multicultural partnership efforts at Google TV. And what that really focuses on is working with both our internal product team and our content partners like the Netflixes, Primes, and HBOs of the world to help make sure inclusive and cultural content is discoverable across our platform. Now that mission really extends beyond the borders of our product, which is why we're here at Sundance today, and which is why we are grateful to the Sundance Collective for inviting us to join this conversation. So I also want to recognize members of the Google team who are here today. My boss, Wanho Duran, who, let's give him a round of applause, please. So Wanho, since the YouTube days, really championed a lot of what we do now, making sure the entire multicultural community is represented. And lastly, but certainly not least, someone who you'll hear from after this panel, during this panel, Shalini Govil-Pai, who is a champion and a sponsor for all of this work. So thank you, enjoy the conversation, and we hope that this is the beginning of a much longer relationship with not just the Gold House, but the broader multicultural organization community that's here. Thank you.
Round of applause, Dami. Thank you so much. Up now is Asian Women Representation, moderated by Emmy Award-winning co-anchor of ABC's Nightline, Juju Chang. A trailblazer for the API community, Juju has been convening major breaking news for ABC News for decades and regularly reports for 2020 and Good Morning America. In 2021, Juju co-anchored an ABC News live special, Stop the Hate, the rise in violence against Asian Americans and murder in Atlanta, which won a front page award. Please welcome to the stage, Juju Chang. Round of applause.
You can tell I'm not a performer because I came out even before my introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I am a Sundance virgin, so this is very exciting, and I feel like I've joined the cool kids club because everybody in here is much cooler than any journalism convening that I've ever been to. But I will say I want to start by thanking Sunrise House and obviously its component sponsors. I really talk about how TAF and Gold House and 3AD are really, their superpower is convening power. And the fact that they're able to gather people here is really powerful. And I have to take a second to thank Daniel Day Kim for being DDK. Just because I've watched him walk this walk, think about it, whitewashing in Hollywood, equal pay, all of the things, right? And really do it with grace and with dignity and with real intelligence, and then to really step into the void when anti-AAPI hate spiked, and to really lead along with Daniel Wu and others, and really be a major force. Also want to, right? You can applaud that for sure. Also want to applaud Norman and Priska Bay at TAF for their leadership, and Bing Chen at Gold House for doing all that they do throughout Hollywood. So with that, I just had to take a minute of personal privilege. We have an awesome, badass group of women who are about to take the stage. We're going to talk about AAPI representation for women. So let me just start by introducing everyone. Apoorva Charan is a producer from All Caps. Come on up. She has a film here at Sundance called Joyland. Clearly, you've heard of it. It's got all the buzz and all the glitter and glam, and we'll talk about that in a second. Maia Shibutani is here. Woo! And Maia, as you know, is a two-time Olympic medalist, author, producer, sports envoy, part of the Shib Sibs. And what I love is that her brother is here in support. Hello. So adorable. Reena Mehta, a colleague of mine from 9 months ago. She's now a senior vice president at streaming and digital content at ABC News, and she had, they brought Pretty Baby, right? Brooke Shields here to Sundance just yesterday to great acclaim. I watched it and was shook. It was really, really good. And Shalini Govil-Pai of, as you heard, Google TV. She's VP and GM of Google TV. So welcome, ladies, to the stage. You know, I've been sitting here all day because the panels have been so awesome, and one of them was immigrant stories are our stories. And so I want to just start with a minute from each of you telling us your immigrant story. So whoever wants to start, Shalini, go.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay, so I grew up in Bombay, India. I still call it Bombay, even though it's supposed to be Mumbai. And, you know, Bombay is all about Bollywood. And so I always wanted to be part of Bollywood. And an interesting anecdote is when I was 10, I got a child actress role in this movie. It was called Hum Bacche Hindustan Ke, which means Children of India. And the movie came out, and I was like, yay, this is my path to stardom in film industry. And the movie, I guess, was really bad because after one day, it was out of the theaters. Many, many years later, when I was working at YouTube, I told my team, hey, let's find this movie and let's make sure it's digitized and up on YouTube, and we couldn't find it. So you know, I kind of realized that maybe movie making, even though I love it, is not my cup of tea. Maybe no one really wants me to be an actress. But I was pretty good in math and science, pretty cliched, but I was. And so I took on to computer graphics. And at that time, there was a small company called Pixar Animation. I tell you, at that time, it was so small, no one knew about it. But they started coming up with these short movies, and one of them won an Oscar. It was Tintoy. If you haven't seen it, you have to watch it. They're amazing movies. And that really got me inspired that, hey, maybe I could be a computer graphics specialist and start making movies that way. And so that's what I specialized in. I did my engineering in IIT in India, which is where I met my husband, Raj, who's here too. And then I joined Pixar Animation as my first career out of college. And so we worked very, very closely. So we had the techies on one side of the building, and then we had the artists on the other side of the building, and then the art directors, and John was like kind of in the center, and he kind of made sure we all talked to each other in the right language. But we really made some amazing movies. I was on Toy Story as well as A Bug's Life. And so those were like my two great films that I was really, really proud of. And you know, now I think if I look at animation, it's all computer graphics, right? There's no hand-drawn animation anymore. And so that was the revolution that we created. And then from there, you know, I had moved to the US by that time. I moved on to doing a couple of startups, and then I was at YouTube for many years, really looking at film production from the other side, which is really distribution. And how does the internet allow for distribution of films? Really making sure that anyone who has a voice and wants to say something can do it. And so that's really the mission of YouTube. And then over the last 5 years, I've been on Google TV, which, you know, again, very proud of this platform. Really, our whole heart is into promoting diverse voices, and that's what we try to do on the platform.
And that's what we'll dig in today. That was perfect. Thank you. I love how computer science degrees can lead to and the entertainment business. Reena.
Hi, I was not good at math and science at all. So I grew up in upstate New York. I'm first generation Indian, and my parents moved from Rajasthan, and like maybe many of your households, was do more homework, read more, and all I wanted to do was watch TV. I've watched everything in the 80s and 90s. I have it all in my brain, and I used to think they were my friends. And since I was really, really young, I always wanted to work in TV in all of its forms. And I'm at ABC News Studios now and do the non-sort of linear content, so everything that's narrative nonfiction. We premiered Pretty Baby, as you said last night, which was very, very exciting for our team who's here. And the narrative nonfiction, and then a lot of the weekly news programs, the digital websites, podcasts, and radio, and then our ABC News Live Fast channel. And I started in kids TV and moved to scripted and was at HBO Max prior to this. But ABC News was a really exciting place for me because I think it's a very complicated time in this country's history and also globally. So to really be a part of a purpose-driven kind of brand, and also we have an amazing president who's really trying to bring a lot of diverse stories to the forefront on all of our platforms, and it's a very exciting place to be.
That's awesome. Maia.
I was born in New York City, grew up in Old Greenwich. I'm third generation Japanese American. My mom's side of the family is from Tokyo, and dad's side of the family is from Kyoto. Because my background is sports, specifically figure skating, I tended to move around a lot in order to pursue that dream. So after spending the first couple years in Old Greenwich, moved to Colorado, then Ann Arbor, Michigan, and now I'm living in Los Angeles.
That's awesome. And we're so excited to hear about the creative endeavors that you're undertaking. Go ahead.
I'm Apoorva. I was born in Hyderabad, India, and my family and I moved to Northern California when I was 6 years old. Our immigrant story, I think we were bad immigrants because we kept trying to leave America. We went back to India multiple times, and then I ended up living in Singapore for 6 years before I ended up coming back to the US. And I think, you ask about an immigrant story, I feel like we get to define what that is, and I think today I feel like nationality is fluid, just like all of the other things, so we get to say if we're immigrants or not, and you get to choose where you belong, and I think that's like the most powerful.
Absolutely, and I love that Maia's family is third generation, right? This idea that one of the tropes that plagues our community is the perpetual foreigner myth, that no matter how many generations your family's been here, they take one look at you and say, where are you from? Or they say, you speak English really well. I've come up with a great comeback for that too. Thank you, so do you. It's never an Asian person who says that, by the way. And Maia was also gracious enough to say, you should say where your story is from. So I was born in Seoul, moved to the States when I was 4, grew up in Northern California, moved to New York 10 days after graduation. I always felt, because I grew up in Silicon Valley when it wasn't 25%, Asian American engineers. And so I really felt other. I always grew up thinking that my family talked funny and our food smelled funny and that I looked funny. I was teased on the playground. So it really was that kind of feeling other that I think informed my entire journalism career. So I think our journeys, each and every one of ours, informs your storytelling. So let's dive in with a kind of, give us a state of play where you think AAPI women representation is, both on and off camera, and maybe, in your own lanes, right? So, Apoorva, let's start with you. You have this incredible film, but as a filmmaker, how do you think AAPI women are represented, again, in all walks?
I've been very, very fortunate because I got to work, my first feature was a Pakistani film. We had our entire cast was from Pakistan. We had so many wonderful crew members. It was all Pakistani and South Asians. So and it was almost an all-female crew. Like all of our producers, our head of departments, so many women. But
so please tell the audience, those who don't know, what your film is about and the premise.
So Joyland is a Pakistani film. It is about a man from a lower middle class Muslim family who gets a job at an erotic dance theater in Pakistan and falls in love with a trans starlet and the effect that romance has on his wife because he's married at home and the rest of his family.
And you should know that Joyland was the first Pakistani film to premiere at Cannes. Which palms did you get? You got a couple.
We won the Uncertain Regard Jury Prize in the Queer Palm.
And it was also the first Pakistani film to get shortlisted for the Oscars. But tell me about the portrayal. I mean, obviously your film, sort of broadens the lens on AAPI female representation.
Yeah, I think because we have Alina Khan, who's our trans lead, and I think it just expands of like, when we say female representation, how do we be inclusive to include everyone, right? So everyone who chooses to identify as a woman, I think that's how we got to broaden it. And I would just say it's Asian representation, not because they're all local, they're from Pakistan. But I think the fact that the story was so universal and that it spoke to people in Western audiences allowed for that representation to expand.
And so, Maia, you are an author. You have written a number of books centered on AAPI characters. How do you think those characters are represented, and what were you trying to achieve in your series?
Well, before I answer about the books, I think it's just worth acknowledging when you're talking about the state of representation for Asian women now that this is a really exciting time. This is my first Sundance, similar to you, but I've wanted to come to this festival for many years now. But just I realized that the Sunrise Collective and this gathering or these panels didn't exist prior to this. And even with this panel, I'm having the opportunity to meet all of you for the first time, and I just think that it's that connectivity that will lead to even more exciting collaboration moving forward. But back to the book. I just feel very grateful for everyone here in this space, but with the books, I work on them with my brother, Alex Shibutani, who's in the crowd supporting me. But the intention behind it for us has always been, let's create stories that we wish we had as children, because that will really serve the next generation. Representation is so important. I think it gives children such a sense of self-worth. And so our picture book that's coming out in April is about 36 Asian American and Pacific Islander figures, both historic and contemporary. And that's just so important because it covers such a vast degree of experiences, different career paths, and something that's special about children's literature especially is that you're building those core memories, because these kids are going to be reading it with their parents. They'll then learn how to read it by themselves, but just to have that sense of self so early on, I think is a gift that we hope to give more children.
I do think that middle school era is when kids read the most. My kids are like grown-ass people now, and they just don't read as much, and those stories live large in their brains. Reno?
Well, I think in front of and behind the camera, you know, corporately in a lot of rooms I've been in, I'm usually the only person that looks like me. So I'm very conscious of that, but I do think that is changing a lot. And I'm really lucky that I have a very strong team. And we talk about sort of, you know, within even the AAPI diaspora, like even saying that it's so large, there's so many different factions of it. There's first, second, third generation, as we see on this panel. So how do we, one, deliver the news in that way? And also very quickly, because we want to be first to market. But then also, how do we tell our narrative nonfiction stories and docs, and like, who is it for, why is it there? And really trying to task myself and the team for really being accountable when we look at our entire slate, right? Who are the creators? Where did the story come from? Who are the main characters we're highlighting, and sort of what is the balance on screen? And I think for talent as well, especially on the new platforms, we work really, really closely with our talent and press team to sort of see who is there. And, you know, a lot of these roles, I'm sure Juju knows well, no one like hands you a template and is like, this is how you work in the news, and here's how you report. And especially when you feel like you are the other, you also have a little imposter syndrome. So what I try to do a lot too is, for people who might not have the experience, I'm like, let's give them a chance, right? Here's what the goal is. Let's see if you can do this. And here's how we can set you up for success, which is really important, I think, in this space in general, because there's always this push and pull of like, well, they don't have the experience. Well, did they have the access to have that experience? And like, how do we provide that opportunity for them in front of and behind the camera?
Shalini?
Will you give me access?
I sure will.
Okay. I'll take you up on it. I don't know if you want it, but still.
I want it. I want to talk about it.
Okay. You know, I look at it from a lens of more of how do you raise the voices. So I'm not creating the voices as all of you are, but really, you know, through YouTube and through Google TV, what our mission is how do we uplift various voices? And sometimes our algorithms, we're very proud of our algorithms, by the way, but sometimes they put you into these rabbit holes, and it's very hard to get out of them. And so what we've done is we've really created a team that their sole mission is to figure out what is this trending content and how do we make sure it uplifts voices that maybe people would not know about otherwise. So one of the things that we just released today, in fact, is an entire row of Sundance collection. So the Sundance collection is going to be featured prominently on the platform. We do that regularly at YouTube as well. And so that's really the lens that we take, is like, how can we make sure that people are viewing things that's outside of their purview sometimes and really enjoying experiences that maybe they didn't know that existed.
That's great. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the tropes that we've seen in media and entertainment over the years. We all know, whether it's the dragon lady or the, you know, hypersexualized Asian American or Asian woman, or the, you know, whatever it is. How do we fight against those tropes? How do we humanize, you know, API women on screen more? Obviously, you're shattering all sorts of tropes by your filmmaking, but how can we do it better?
I think a lot of research, a lot of, at least in terms of film and character development, and when we're being very conscious about how we're portraying those characters. I think our director, Saim, did a really good job of really integrating with the trans community and working with Alina Khan, and so that he knew her, where she came from. And it's really interesting because in our story with a man, a woman, and a trans woman, it is the trans woman who is the most self-actualized. She is the one who knows what she wants. She is the ambitious one. She is the one who knows how to work in the system and doesn't falter. Whereas everybody else who kind of isn't really in tune with what they want, they're the ones struggling against the system.
And so tell us about the struggle, your journey to get the film made, because it can't have been smooth sailing the whole way.
It wasn't smooth sailing, but I think the challenges were all expected. The challenges were because it was a first-time feature director, a first-time feature producer, a non-English language film trying to raise money in America saying, hey, we think this is world cinema and not just film for, like a tiny indie movie that is just for a certain region. So I think that was the challenge, and I think we overcame it just by showing the craftsmanship over and over again. I think building a body of work over years and decades to be like, we're ready to make this, please trust us, give us the resources to make it.
You have a room full of creatives and filmmakers. I was talking to a composer earlier, a screenwriter. What advice would you give them as they're trying to, face these headwinds?
I would say really focus on the craft. I think that is the stuff that sets you apart. I think that feeling of being othered that we're talking about, like that is actually your superpower. That is the thing that's gonna set you apart. That's what makes you and your work very unique. And that is your offering and what you put out into the world. So just focusing on the craft and your craft.
Maia, how conscious were you in trying to develop characters? Obviously, this is a sibling character, but how conscious were you that you were trying to fight some of those tropes, and how have those tropes affected you in the way that you see the world?
Well, for us, we weren't just fighting the tropes of the stories that were available, but also in ice dance, it's a very Eurocentric sport. We were a sibling team. We were the first Asian or Asian American team to have success of a certain level. So we didn't necessarily have a roadmap that we could follow, but I think that we took that challenge and it empowered us as creators. And when we talk about representation, I think things that are told on screen are magical. It has the power to transcend communities. But if we're talking about how Asian women are viewed in general, I think that there are ways that we can all be very intentional in our daily lives. And so while I love original stories, it's very common now for stories to be adapted from books or based on true events. So there are things that we can do to support female-led businesses or individuals who are doing special things, just because by showing your intention and showing that that is a worthwhile community to uplift, you can only assume that once the business side gets starting to think about it, that you'll hopefully see more stories that accurately represent what you want to see.
That's awesome. Reena, more and more we talk about the importance of being in the room when it happens, and you're in that room, and as you say, you're often one of the few women of color, API women. How conscious are you in because you're in charge of streaming? You've got full feature length things. You've got mini docs on Hulu. You've got ABC News product like our show. How conscious are you, or how do you try to fight some of the AAPI tropes for women, or just perhaps more broadly? And what ways do you do it?
I would say I'm super conscious of it, and part of it is I think recently what's been happening with the API community, making sure that we're reporting on it, because Juju and I were actually talking about this a few days ago, is that with the attacks in Atlanta, ABC News was the first to report on it as a big story, which was a really big deal. So I think a lot of it is making sure with our reporters and our journalists that surfacing that, even though, we always look at what everyone else is doing. I'd love to say we don't, but we do. But when it's sort of comes like, oh, well, no one else is doing it, it's like, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't. We should do the right thing because that's how we want to report it, and making sure that we're giving the right information. But I think with the other lines of business, not just for the AAPI group, but a lot of other diverse groups and minorities, is also making sure we're not telling the same story. Right, so there's a lot of, and I say this broadly, like trauma content, right, about overcoming and being the other, and sort of then finally being on the side you're supposed to be on. And I think that can be really, really dangerous with nonfiction content in general, and sort of telling things that are a little bit more positive or different, or that maybe it's not about being Asian and you're American or a global citizen and you're represented in the cast, or how it is, which I think sometimes gets lost. And you see, with a lot of groups, it's like the same story, and there's like, we're a lot more complex. We're from a lot of different places. We've had a lot of different experiences that I think are just very important in the room to surface those. And it's hard, when I'm younger in my career, especially when I worked on the scripted side, it's not easy to be in a room of development executives and say, not sure this is the right representation of what we're trying to do. And I've had actually bosses say to me, I never really thought about that. I'm so glad you brought that up in that way, because I didn't realize that was your experience, right? So it's hard, but when you do sort of bring that up, especially in those kind of smaller content creative rooms, 9 times out of 10, the reception will be warm. It will be like, oh, I didn't know that was your experience. But it always takes, I always try with our younger executives to say, we work in an open environment. You should say something, and if you don't feel comfortable, come into my office.
You were at HBO Max for a long time before coming to ABC News. Tell me ways in which, in the creative process, you were looking at whether it's a character or a showrunner or whatever it is, ways that you've encountered that, or maybe ways in which being an API woman has affected your decision-making or the way that you were viewed.
That's a big question.
I'm just giving you a big net.
I would say, there were certain shows that we were working on, and sometimes in different contexts, it'd be like, well, that's not believable, like that wouldn't really happen. And you're like, but how would you know? Because you don't necessarily represent that, right? And I would also not presume to say, too, the other thing that I'm very conscious of is that I also don't represent every first-generation American who grew up in upstate New York and had immigrant parents. So I think it's also being like open to that as well. And then again, it's such a simple thing, but it's like, who is the show for, and why are you trying to make it, and what is the creative direction? And then pushing the boundaries on that too, which I think, places like HBO Max, thankfully, it's like such a large group of creative executives, and they've made some of the most amazing content. But with HBO Max as well, we were trying to attract a different kind of audience from HBO, and looking at smaller shows that could grow, because there's so many things that just because on paper, no one has done this before, it won't perform, the data says X, and this is true of any brand actually, but we also have to take the risk. Just because it didn't exist doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make it, and then you iterate on it, right? Like similar to tech, like you look at something and you're like, okay, that didn't work because of X, Y, and Z, let's continue to iterate, and knowing that it's not that didn't work, we should never do that again, which happens a lot, right? Oh, that film didn't work, so it must mean there's no audience for it, and that's just simply not true.
Shalini, tell me how the idea of being an API woman in your space plays out. Has it sort of hindered or helped in any way? And what ways do you try to amplify API women in your spaces?
Yeah. So I'll take the second question first. We have a lot of really amazing programs. First of all, I feel like the fact that streaming has become a thing is a big deal, because it has changed certain business models, and some companies are still adapting. And at the same time, it's created global content that everyone can watch, no matter where they're sitting. So I don't have to be in Korea to watch a Korean movie anymore. I can watch it from my home in the US. And I think what it's done is it's really opened up an understanding that I think was harder in the past. Like, oh, I didn't know about that culture because I've not, people learn about culture from movies and from shows. And this has really enabled that kind of understanding that has been phenomenal. And so what we do a lot in my team and across Google is we actually watch, and Juan Ho has run a lot of series of this, we actually watch content from different cultures, and then we'll talk about it. And I feel like that has been amazing in just opening up and exposing ourselves to, oh, this is the stereotype that I had. I don't know where I got it from, but this is really how it should be represented. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is really a program that we've started is what we call influencers. And so we invite influencers to come and talk about their lives. How do they become the person that they are today? And what was the magic, especially in movies, that helped them become that person? We recently had Simu Liu on it. We had Chloe Zhang on it. And they really talked about their life. How did they grow up? And what was it that inspired them to really break whatever was coming in their way? And so those are some of the ways that we really try to accomplish creating voices for our influencers. Personally, for me, I think just being a woman in tech was a challenge in the beginning. I was the only woman in my class, and my husband was lucky to get me. But you know, I think over time, you know, just like all of you have experienced, I think just bringing in more voices that are similar to ours really helps break a lot of the stereotypes. So
I was in a conversation here at the festival about the success of shows like Squid Game, you know, on Netflix, the #1 show and what the appeal is and how it's turning more into global content. I'm wondering, Reena, if you've encountered that too, because clearly that's on your mind.
Yeah, I think, you know, with the content we have on Hulu and Disney Plus, we think about that a lot, right? That like local is so important, but how will this globally translate? And the news also happens very quickly, right, as all of you know. But making sure that we distribute our content in a way, and how does it translate? And then also looking at, I can't talk about them yet, but looking at some series from international creators too, and how that will translate to our audience, because it is so global, to your point. Like, I mean, a few years ago, if you told me I could watch a show from like Southeast Asia, like the same day everyone else is, I'd be like, no way, the server can't handle that. But it's very, very exciting. And then also just how, you know, in our studios group, which we have a lot of pop culture and true crime content, but everybody loves true crime everywhere, doesn't matter what language it's in, which is also really nice to think about too, just in terms of like how it's not just here, that it can be everywhere.
I find that we in news often look for experts of color, just because they shouldn't all be middle-aged white men. And that, I think, is one way of sort of reframing things. And I remember spending time with Shonda Rhimes in Shondaland, and she was saying, you know, Grey's Anatomy is not a story about black doctors. Grey's Anatomy is a story about great doctors who have great sex lives and have great characters and great personalities, and that's why, and some of them happen to be black. But many of her main characters, you know, it's just a way of humanizing them. So the stories our stories don't necessarily have to be about, oh, I'm Asian, I'm so Asian. It's just, I happen to be Asian and I've, you know, done this thing. So I'm curious if that's in any way the way that you approach your storytelling.
Absolutely. When I look for stories to produce, I'm actually not concerned about the language. I actually have never produced anything in English. All of my shorts, everything has always been in another language, in Spanish and Mandarin and Norwegian, and still nothing in English. So, and the fact that I'm based out of LA, right? So, yeah, language I think doesn't matter. Where you're shooting doesn't matter, but I think the emotional seed of the story and what the characters are going through, their relationships, I think I need to know that there's something interesting and tangible there to explore, and that is absolutely how I.
And how do you feel about subtitles, et cetera, the way that you translate?
I love reading subtitles. Like everyone else should too, and I think it's gotten easier. Like people make arguments of like it's easier to read subtitles at home versus it's easier to read subtitles, and I'm like, no. We have like grown up watching, like Hollywood has exported so much content to every country around the world. I think it is time to bring some of our very specific stories and share them with the world. So.
Very good. So tell us about some of your storylines and, you know, what themes you're trying to develop and in what ways do you think, you know, it highlights sort of what it means to be an Asian American woman?
Storylines meaning in
your
the
book? Yeah. And
So-
tell us about the picture book.
So it covers 36 figures, and I think that it's important that it's both historic and contemporary. It's evenly split between male and female, but also I think that so far, unfortunately, our education system has failed us in some regard, where people who were accomplishing things a long time ago didn't have that same visibility and platform. So I think it's really important to acknowledge what's come before and led us to the place that we're at now. But then as far as including contemporary figures that are in all different businesses, silos, politics, sports, it just allows children to see that there are so many different possibilities. And
Give us a few examples.
so our vice president is in the book, current vice president, which is very exciting. And then also there's a hockey player, Julie Chu, women's hockey team. Sunisa Lee, and then let's see, Helen Jha, who's an activist. So really trying to be all-encompassing in exposing children to all the different possibilities.
The book comes out in April. Tell us about your process. Did you interview them? Did you profile them?
We profiled them. Alex and I worked with a co-author, and we were so lucky with the team that we had because it's comprised entirely of people who are Asian American or Asian, and so I think that we were all extra committed to making sure that we did these people justice, because it's about creating something where people can feel seen in literature, and that's very important.
And so contemporary and historical figures. I can't wait to see it. Reena, one of the other panels talked about this idea of multiculturalism, of solidarity, that it's not just one lane. Certainly the AAPI experience involves dozens of cultures and dozens of languages and faith traditions and all that. How do you think those kinds of stories, and not just Asian American stories, but stories that involve like bad acts, right? Like a Mexican, Cambodian, backdrop of BLM, the kind of solidarity that we are seeing coming out of the racial reckoning during the pandemic.
It's funny you should ask that, because we have actually, while I'm not a math and science person, I actually do love data and think about how that integrates into our content. So especially for a lot of our digital and streaming platforms, we utilize our research team a lot in terms of how do these groups sort of see themselves? What are the issues that they're facing, and how are they similar or not similar, et cetera? But then how do we also convey that on our platforms, right? Because we really only have an image, a tile, a headline, a landing page, and it's complicated, right? Because we wouldn't necessarily put a section about news that's AAPI, because I don't know how much of the audience identifies with that. And so how do you kind of convey that, and really working on sort of integrating the research and doing a lot of insightful focus groups to really understand who we're trying to attract and why. And I think that the stories, especially for the narrative nonfiction, to your point, it's not scripted, but essentially stories are about families too, right? And so it doesn't really matter where you're from, and those are so translatable. So really thinking about that too, and the solidarity of how we bring that together. But it's complicated too, because it's not, terms change, how people identify, and if they even want to self-identify, and how we're also conveying that stories to the audience, who really likes to also give us their feedback and opinion on Twitter. So also thinking about that with the research and the numbers. But and also making sure that the team is very abreast of how we want to talk about these stories, and then also how they change, right? Because I'm sure you've experienced this a lot. How we would talk about something 10 years ago is very different, and we're thinking about library content too, and how we want to build a franchise. What will that mean in the future too?
So I can't believe we're coming on 5:27 already. So I'm going to just ask a broad question, and then just ask you for your summation thoughts, which is, so much of what we've learned in the anti-AAPI hate that spiked was that one of the solutions is education, right? I profiled a middle schooler who was lobbying for one day out of 180 days of middle school devoted to Asian American history. And she called the campaign 1 in 180. And she managed to get it passed in the state legislature. The other huge component is narrative change, which is why we're here. And so I wonder what you guys think about this idea of the impact of narrative change, how you invest in it, how you think about it, again, in your own lanes. And Shalini, let me start with you. And again, closing thoughts, because we're rounding the final corner.
I also wanted to share one anecdote when I was at Pixar. Steve Jobs was our CEO. I'm hoping everyone remembers Steve. And I remember going into this daily, and the tech guys were saying, oh, but this was not exactly right, and this was not exactly right. And Steve just looked at us and he said, in the end, no amount of tech can fix a bad story. And it's really the story that has to shine. So I feel like, as we're talking about stories, I think that's an important lesson that we always have to keep in mind, that it's not about the tech, it's not about the platform, it's not about anything really. It's really about what is the story that you want to create, and then what is the story you want to tell. And these stories, this is my summation thought, these stories have a power on our subconscious in ways that sometimes we don't even realize. And so I think the narrative, like what is the narrative that we want to frame that really inspires people to know I can do better, I can do more, I can really break these stereotypes and be the person that I want to be. I think that's what stories do, and that's why I've always been in the film industry from my vantage point. And always from Google TV, our mission is how do we lift those narratives that really seek to educate and seek to inspire. And so that's the closing thought that I'll leave behind.
Reena.
I would say, similarly, like how do we take risks and how do we make sure the rooms in front of and behind the camera do have representation? And I think at ABC News in particular, across the org, not just mine, we have a race and culture team that is really important, and they are in different sections in different departments, but they also come together. So when we look at our Heritage monthly specials, there's a collective group that works on it, which is really important because a lot of great ideas come out and a lot of things that people haven't thought of, and they really work together and collaborate, and they translate to so many audiences. And again, being the first with a lot of specials or shows is not easy, but it just takes kind of one voice. And for me in particular, I'm just very focused on making sure I'm trying to champion those internally and externally. Just because someone, it's their first idea, their first show, their first logline, doesn't mean they can't do it. They just need the support to really be successful.
I think it's really important to keep in mind that we can't expect one story to cover everyone's story. So it's really important that we have care for other communities as well, and that we're good allies, because uplifting everyone will only allow us to continue to tell the stories that we want to tell. But then when it comes to how I proceed on a daily basis, I've been very fortunate to find great mentors. And when you were mentioning earlier being the only in a space, that's something that I've felt before. And it's not comfortable to put yourself out there and to sometimes face challenge or rejection. But I think that there's so much that you can learn from that, not only for your future, but then it also informs how you want to create space for other people and how you want to treat the next generation. And so I'm so excited to hear about all the projects you're working on, because it will make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think to add on to what Maia was saying, the first time that I think we felt like we weren't the only ones was when we became the decision makers and we were able to choose who was in the room with us. And so I think making sure that AIPI women or AIPI people in general are decision makers, I think that's very important to sustain the impact of narrative. And I think focusing on stories that emotionally unify audiences regardless of culture is probably going to be very important in terms of unifying all of us.
This is great. Well, I look at this audience and I see a room of creatives and storytellers, and I'm so excited to see what comes from this. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining in conversation. Thank you, TAF, Goldhouse, 3AD for having us.